I want to begin to enter into this story by really emphasizing that this is about community life. Community life for and of and between those who are followers of Jesus. Peter even gets at it when he says, Lord, how many times shall I forgive another member of the church? It's about community life. And I want to focus on that because here in this time of pandemic, we are unable to gather as a community like we have in the past. And so how could this community life parable become a part of the rhythm of our daily life in these extraordinary times? I want to talk about that a little later in my sermon this morning. But to really get our feet on the ground and get us into the story, I want to talk about two different kinds of tubs. You know what a tub is. It's something that holds water. And I want to talk about two different kinds. The first kind of tub is one that I think a lot of us have had experiences of bathing in, and it's a bathtub. Heard a story just recently about a very special kind of bathtub. This special bathtub was in a very, very fancy hotel. It's the kind of hotel where you walk into and you think you've entered a palace. It's where every sort of whim that you might have is taken care of, and the staff around is catering to what they perceive to be all of your needs. And the story I heard was that after this extravagant welcome, those who were there in this very fancy hotel decided that after days of travel it would be great to take a bath. And so one of the company went into the bathroom, looked at this wonderful fancy bathtub with these beautiful soaps all around, and it smelled extravagant. And they reached over and turned the water on, turned the faucet on, and what came out was this lukewarm, kind of icky brown substance, and it began to splash on the tile in the tub, and couldn't believe it. And the first thing that came to their mind was, I paid a lot of money for this place. I am entitled to a better bath. That was one story that I heard recently. The other story was a little different, but it was about a tub. One of my friends had been out on a day hike with some of their friends. They were hot, all of them dusty and tired at the end of a long day, up and down, around hills, through mountain passes. And as they got back to their starting point, they saw this trough of sort of brownish water underneath this faucet. And so they went over to it and they turned on the water, and out came this cold water and began to fill this cattle trough, basically. And they were so humbled that at the end of their long day, they had this precious, beautiful gift, this kind of brown but cold water. They began to splash it on themselves and wash their faces and their necks and arms and shoulders. One of them even took their shoes off and put their feet in. He said it felt amazing. Better than any bath they had ever taken. They were humbled at this gift more than they could have asked for. So, with these two tubs in mind, I want to pose this question about how we live life. Do we live in our thoughts and our deeds, in our spirits and our minds, in our actions? Do we live a life of entitlement acting as if there was something about us that makes it inherent that we deserve not just something, but every good thing. Is there something about us, whether it's the amount of hard work we put in life, or the fact that we paid for something, or if you want to dig down a little deeper, is it based on our gender or our race or our social status amongst one another? Is there something about us or what we do that creates within us this feeling of entitlement? I deserve this. Or do we live a life of humility, acting in a way that's based on the amazing grace and endless mercy of God, where out of that tub of grace flows to us in our lives so much more than we could ever imagine? Sort of like that water in that cattle trough at the end of a long day's hike. So much amazing grace that our hearts are turned to thanksgiving and gratitude. Till we laugh and play in the tub and share the water that's there, washing dirty hands and feet and arms and shoulders with one another, laughing, playing, splashing? Or do we complain because our well-appointed, tiled, fancy tub with the special smelling soaps isn't up to the standards that we think we deserve? How do we live life? And I think our answer to the question, whether it's living out of entitlement or living out of humility and gratitude, really does inform our practice of forgiveness. It informs our practice of how we think about forgiveness and how we live that out. So I want to get into the story of Peter and Jesus. Our gospel starts with Peter coming to Jesus and talking about another member of the community who has, I believe, sinned against him, and says, how often should I forgive this one? And he offers maybe 7 times, which is a cool number. I like it. Maybe Peter is thinking very concretely, maybe in a way that's very imaginable. If someone sins against me, maybe if I can forgive them once a day for a week, 7 times, is that enough, Jesus? It's so concrete and practical, and let's get this job done, Jesus. Is that how I should approach this? And Jesus goes, oh, wait. No. In our community together, we got to not imagine forgiveness as something concrete and achievable. We got to think about forgiveness as something unimaginable. Something that's so abundant that there's really no way we could actually achieve it. But out there is this vision, not of scarcity of forgiveness, but out of this deep well of what God has given to us, we can forgive beyond any rule or endpoint. In fact, it's something that just becomes part of who we are together. So much so that we don't even think about it. We just practice forgiveness. So I'm going to ask you this question. In your daily life, as you practice forgiveness, does it belong to the realm of the concrete and imaginable and I can get the task done? This task of forgiveness? Or does it belong to the unimaginable? Does it flow from something that's just overwhelmingly abundant that you just want to keep doing it and stop counting the number of times that you do it? It becomes part of the very fabric of who you are and that's a little bit of what Jesus is getting at. Maybe another way of looking at this is from a story, again, that I heard just recently. It was from a pastor friend of mine, and she was dining out with her family. It was a fairly nice place, not super fancy, but it wasn't, drive-through takeout. It was pre-pandemic, so no one was there with masks on, and it was fairly crowded. Even though it was a fairly nice restaurant, she related to me that the service there was terrible. That the waiter that they had was extremely rude and inattentive, not just to them, but to the tables around them. And that finally, after ordering and they got their food, it was cold, and one of the orders for the kids was not right, and her child started crying, and they began to grumble and grinch with one another, and they were just ready to throw up their hands and just get out of the joint. And then something strange happened. The table next to them, there was also a family. And that when their orders arrived, they received their food. They could see that it was also cold. They couldn't tell if it was exactly what they had ordered. But at the table next to them, the family bowed their heads, folded their hands, and prayed. Come, Lord Jesus, be our guest. Let these gifts to us be blessed. May every table, everywhere, always have a goodly share. So how do you live? How do we live? A life of humility where everything is gift, where everything is to be thanksgiving filled, where there is enough and more to share with others. We live a life of entitlement, on the other hand, where it's about what I deserve, and there's really never enough. And I don't really care about anyone else. How do you live this life of forgiveness? From what tub do you draw? Now, to bring this home to Peter, Jesus still tells a story about a life together in community. And it's a story that's set in a picture of a king and the slaves of the king. And so as the story begins, there is this king that wants to settle all the accounts with all of his community of slaves. And there was one particular slave that owed the king 10,000 talents. And I want to say something about this because this is crazy. 1 talent in Jesus' day was equivalent to about 6,000 denarii. Now, if you remember your Sunday school Bible stories, 1 denarii is the wage for 1 day's labor. So 1 talent is 6,000 days' labor. And if my math is correct, what this slave owed the king was equal to 60 million days worth of labor. And if you take out your calculator and divide that by 365, what we're talking about here is he owes the king 164,000 plus years of labor. Unimaginable debt. Probably recognizing this in the strangeness of the story, he goes to the king and he pleads for mercy. And out of this sense of mercy, his debt is forgiven, and the beautiful word is he was released. It's an absurd situation with an absurd amount of mercy. But as the story goes on, somehow that's not the tub that this particular slave is drawing water from. Not the tub of abundance and thanksgiving, but the tub of entitlement. So he finds another slave and says, hey, you owe me 100 days worth of wages. Pay up. Can't. He begs for mercy. And what does this first slave do? Throws him into prison. Says, you're not coming out. They pay the whole thing. Refused to let him go. That's how we operate with one another. When we operate out of a sense of entitlement, I deserve what you owe me. Do you see how entitlement begins to skew our relationships with one another? So I ask once again, what tub do you bathe in? What tub do you draw water from? It really does determine how we live with one another, especially, I think, how we live a life of forgiveness for one another. Are we about gracious abundance, letting forgiveness flow into us and out to others? Or are we hoarders, entitled to whatever we can get? There's never enough to share with anybody else. Now, back in the story, the rest of the community is very, very distressed about what is going on, distressed about this behavior. You get a sense that there's a lot of folks in the community that think about abundance and living a life of gratitude and thanksgiving, and that there's more than enough to go around. You kind of get that sense. The king hears about this and begins to get very angry. Locks up the first slave. And there's this sense at the end of the story, and Jesus sort of raises it up, that living out of a sense of entitlement, where there's not enough for me and never enough to share with anyone else, is its own kind of tortured living. That it twists us. And it twists our relationships with one another. And it sort of sets us in a kind of prison. Maybe a prison of self-loathing and self-disappointment. And a sort of focus in on the self that is destructive to the inner part of who we are and our relationships with one another, where we begin to see the other as simply a vehicle to get what I think I deserve. I think that's why the slaves in this king's community were so distressed. The king offers mercy and forgiveness beyond imagination, but when you begin to try to calculate, when you begin to try to determine what can I get out of others, it becomes a twisted community. The rule maybe here is that mercy, love, grace is something that flows to, in, and through us, and that there is so much. The more you begin to share of that with others, the healthier the community becomes, and the healthier you become. This is the faith in which we, as followers of Jesus, are formed. A faith that is rooted in this amazing tub of abundance. And it doesn't always look like a fancy hotel tub with nice smelling soaps next to it. No, sometimes this tub from which this amazing grace flows to us is sort of like the cattle trough at the end of a long day. But it's amazing. It sort of sets us in position with God, a position where God recognizes how our life can be like not an easy journey. And that even a tub of sort of cold but sort of musty water is something that we delight to share with one another. Now, as I said at the beginning, normally we practice this together in community and inside the walls of a physical building. But here during this time of pandemic, when our life is physically separated from one another, how can we be a community that practices the reception of grace and mercy and shares that abundantly with others? This community that is dispersed out into the world, this, I believe, gives us a unique opportunity to show a world in deep need of grace and love, something about who we are. Because it's not about practicing it with one another. It's about practicing it with our neighbors. Those we see in the store behind our masks. Those that are in line with us at Starbucks. Those who, as we're out for a walk, pass by on the other side of the street. How are we going to approach those that we meet, not with the sense of, I'm entitled to get something from them, but I am so filled, I'm going to share something with them. Can you imagine what that might look like if the dispersed community of followers of Jesus began to look in the mirror every morning and say, today I'm going to practice living out of that tub of grace, and not out of the tub of entitlement? I tell you, it could change the world. And not just change the world, it could change us. Because I am convinced that the more we practice receiving the generosity of God and let it flow in and through us and out to others, the healthier we become. And the healthier the world becomes. And I think that is a great vision for us to practice day in and day out this week. And finally, I want to say this. I would like to invite everyone who's part of Messiah in whatever way, who's listening this morning, to send your ideas to me. Write a little email or make a little video on your phone and say, hey, I practiced this way today. Share your stories of receiving the generous love and grace of God and how you shared it with others. It doesn't need to be grand. It can be little things. But these stories we can then share with one another and show how we are a community of grace, a community of mercy, and a community of compassion. Send them in. And let's watch how we do this day in and day out. Thanks be to God. Amen.